Sorry, what? What was that? Your program's throwing an error? It's not running? Wow, well that really is strange. Because luckily you must have all the correct dependencies installed, environment variables, package versions, operating system, frameworks. It doesn't have any syntax errors, no dependent systems were down, not a single runtime error anywhere. You've handled and catered for every possible scenario. Delayed response times, erroneous user input, your code's logic is completely flawless and free of human error and AI generated rubbish and stuff you found on Stack Overflow. Okay, yes, I know, it's time to start debugging. Let's get into it. So let's get some basics out of the way first. I'm using JetBrains Rider, but pretty much all IDEs are exactly the same, whether you're using Visual Studio Code, RStudio. The debugger especially is all going to have pretty much the same configuration and settings. So I've just cloned this repo from GitHub, and I have absolutely no clue why it's throwing this exception. I have a few ideas, just having a look here. So if I just debug this application right now, and I'm using the default Visual Studio shortcut, so it's Control F5 to debug, it's useful to know that. It's just going to throw the exception and do nothing. Did I even debug it correctly? Yeah, boom, threw the exception. Now, one thing that's useful in almost all IDEs is viewing how your debugger, which is, now I have a vague idea of how these work, but essentially it's another process that is running in the background and attaches to the process that is running your application. So in order for this to pause your application, it needs to know when are we going to pause, and that's done by breakpoints. But you can also pause the debugger whenever any exception is thrown. In this case, I'm just going to check all of these boxes to make sure that it stops running and I can inspect my variables and stuff when this error throws. And I expect that checking my variables is not going to be too useful because I can already see the whole gobbledygook of a stack trace that's thrown here. And the reason it's called a stack trace is because, well, it's in the name, stack. So at the very top of the stack trace here, we're going to see the last method that was called and that threw the exception. And in theory, if that returns successfully, then it's popped off the stack. And if we go all the way down here, we should see the entry point to all this. Program. F3 to go to the next bit. So we started off at running program.cs. Program.cs called all of these methods, blah, 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 blah. We don't really care about 99% of that. And that's a skill that's very useful to slowly get good at and recognize that it is a skill. It's glancing over all of the stuff, recognizing most of it's not going to help you, and just focusing your eyes on the one or two things that actually matter. So when these things do overwhelm you in the beginning, if they do, then just understand that's completely normal. And as time goes by, you will get better and figure out what's important to look at. Wow. So anyway, it looks like there's it's expecting to find this SQLite DLL somewhere, and it's already telling me, in order to help diagnose learning problems, consider setting some environment variable so that we point to where it's expecting this to be. Hello. Okay, we're going to run this. It's going to open up. So some useful things about the debugger that I haven't always known is that if this can go away, the white text here under these, so this is the stack trace, this is essentially the same thing that we saw in that big console output, which is not going to be visible yet. But the white methods are all of the methods that are within your application and not in some other library or package that you haven't, that isn't in the repository, although you can think of the repository as all the code in the folder that concerns you. So most of the time, you don't have to look into these other methods to see what's going on. What's also useful is on the left, there's all the different threads, and I've never really needed to actually use this. I think it's quite rare that this will be useful to you. But yeah, just debugging in the main thread. Then on the right, I can actually see the full exception and the stack trace, which essentially gives me the same information that I can see over here in all these frames. Now, obviously, in this case, I'm just setting automatic breakpoints by checking all of these. Now, something that might seem obvious is setting manual breakpoints. So obviously here we've already configured automatic breakpoints to throw at any point in time when an exception is thrown. But it's also useful when you expect to have to step into methods a lot. It can just save you a lot of time if you know where to go, where the error is actually going to be thrown, put your breakpoint there. Breakpoints are also useful if you have two different applications running, talking to each other, set breakpoints in relevant areas in both the programs, display them both in the debugger. Now I've mentioned step into, which essentially just means go to the first line of the method that your cursor is currently on, and that's usually F11. Step out of a method is Shift F11 usually, and then F10 would be step over, which just means go to the next line in the current method. And I'm putting emphasis on shortcuts here because they save you a lot of time. F5 to run the program, Control F5 to start debugging or restart debugging, and Shift F5 to stop the program. Very useful shortcuts. Keep those in mind. If you're not using Visual Studio shortcuts, shame. And debugging in the browser is very similar. It'll probably throw an exception because I haven't got the Docker container running. Okay, cool, it's running. Now this happens to be, wow, we really have made a mess of all these tabs. Command W to close all tabs. This is just gonna be a whole session about keyboard shortcuts. On that note, F12 to open the console Chrome debugger, and in fact I think it's also Alt-Shift-I or something. Alt-Command-I. Oh, it is. Alt-Command-I as well. So if you ever get tired of F12, Alt-Command-I is there to save you. So let's say I want to debug this. Okay, ignore my horrendous text store. Let's say I want to debug this Nextjs application. So now what's happening here is I have some of this is client-side code, which is executing JavaScript in the browser, and some of it's going to be code on the server, which would need to be debugged in the IDE. So it's, again, always a good idea to have an understanding of the system overall to know where to debug. If I go into the sources tab over here, firstly there's a webpack folder, which you probably don't want to go look into because it's going to be all the bundled JavaScript, which is just going to be horrible to read. But in the case of a Nextjs application, if you go to this _n_e folder in the console tab, of course, and you go to whatever component or whatever part of your application it is that is client-side and you want to debug, you can now go, now Chrome is just great. And in fact, I think Edge, most Chromium-based browsers will have a debugger like this. But let's say under this add to cart function, I want to put a breakpoint here on this use effect. But now, okay, so let's actually trigger this breakpoint. If I go into, have I configured this? Oh, it's already being hit. Okay, amazing. So now I can just use the same shortcuts that I was using in my IDE. So if I hit F10, it's going to step over, and I'm not going to step into. But yeah, now you can go and inspect, and on the right here you see all the variables that are in scope, the call stack, and Chrome has this new cool thing called animations. I'm not going to see any here, but if you're on a page that has CSS animations running, you can replay them here. It's pretty cool. You can debug those, and then we need to do that. So debugging a React or like Nextjs application in the browser is mostly fine, but if you're dealing with something like Blazor, which is essentially C# running on top of WebAssembly in the browser. Okay, so I've just started up this other application here, and so it should fail. But if I want to debug any of this, nightmare. Well, it's not a nightmare, but it's just not fun. Now, something that may also be the case is you may expect that the issue that you're having is resulting from you installing a new version of a library or package, or maybe you have a new framework or a new runtime installed, and you suspect that the issue is relating to whatever you did after you installed that new version. So something that can also be useful to do is, I mean, in a way, this can be considered a sort of binary search. And the last version that you had was, say, Python, if I can spell Python 3.2.5, okay? And somewhere in between that, somewhere in your code, some dependent library that you have broke. So now what do? And what's useful just to sort of pick a halfway point, say like 3.5, and then let's say the code works there. Then you may decide, okay, Python 3.7 isn't my next best bet, and let's say it fails over there. Then it depends how far you want to go into this. Now, the next thing that might also seem obvious is comparing your code that is broken with something that's very similar that works. And you may think, wow, that's pretty obvious. But not just comparing line by line and looking at the files yourself limited by the input you could consume with your little eyes, is to just use a folder compare. So if I go, okay, so here are two similar repositories. In this case, I'm using Beyond Compare, but most of the IDEs have their own built-in diff tools. But in this case, it's very easy to see what files differ. For instance, here the README was updated on the 27th of November, but this one on the 27th of Feb. So the red means that it's older. It's just very nice to go dig in and see, and it opens, when you dig into a folder, it opens on both the relevant folder on both sides. Let's go into host. On the left, you can see I have some new lines that differ from the one on the right, and that's all there really is to it. Now, something that might also happen is you're running code, it works all totally fine on your machine, but on somebody else's machine or whatever system you're deploying to, it doesn't work. Maybe you share your code with a mate, or you've got the website running on some Linux VM in Germany and it's not working and you don't know why. So in that case, you usually can't debug against the actual code that's running in that environment, like your friend's laptop. And so this tip is how most people usually start debugging when they haven't quite bothered to see what the debugger does. And that's just to add logs everywhere. Console.writeline. But logging could be a whole long conversation, which might be kind of boring. In production environments, you'll usually be using some sort of telemetry, which just means the system that's receiving inputs from somewhere. In this case, it would be receiving traces and logging data from your applications, and you can just see it all in one place. Yeah, more logging isn't always better, but it's pretty damn close. And lastly, I titled this video, How to Debug Like a Pro. And while the pro will obviously use shortcuts and use little tips and tricks to make their everyday life easier and faster and more enjoyable, a pro really stands out because of their knowledge and experience. They've put more time and effort and found more ways to enjoy themselves in the process to get good. And while I'm of course not a pro myself, what I do know is that you can get 80% of the way there it's really nice and sexy to just use the Pareto principle wherever you can. But that 80% of the way there can be achieved by just having a really good high-level understanding of what's going on, all the dependent systems involved, how your code is executing. Maybe you can find a deployment diagram, sequence diagram, flow diagram, somewhere, some image online that'll help you understand. Talk to someone that knows what's going on, and you'll get 80% of the way there. So if any of this has helped speed up your workflow, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe, of course. See you in the next one.